Good morning, friends. Welcome to Kansas City, Kansas Public Library to our program Integrated Pest Management, also known as Pest and Disease Management in the Garden, presented by Corey Creed from K-State Extension. Corey?
Yeah, thank you, Elena, and thank you all for joining us this morning. So Elena noticed right away when I put this up, and I didn't even think about it, but the title of this is Pest and Disease Management in the Garden. But what I put on this first slide is IPM in the garden, and that may not be familiar to many of you. But IPM stands for Integrated Pest Management, and it's kind of a all-encompassing holistic strategy to try to keep pests and diseases and problems out of your garden without using chemicals as only a last resort. So the main reason for this is that 90% of flowering plants and 75% of crops that we eat depend on insect pollinators. And when we spray too many pesticides in our environment without taking enough care, we lower these numbers. And you may have seen in the news that there's a real risk of pollinator collapse or loss of pollinators in our ecosystem. So we want to see what we can do to try to make sure that doesn't happen. Um, they preserve the energy flow in the environment and they allow for nutrient cycling and for, again, growth and production, like I said, with those crops. So these practices were developed to improve pest control, so not to get worse control of the pests by not using chemicals, but to make it better, but while also minimizing the impacts on the things we want to keep, like pollinators. So just, the textbook definition is that it's a long-term pest control technique, and it relies on things like crop rotation, cultural practices, which you may think of culture as like a country or a group of people, but culture in this means what you do, the actions that you take, that's your culture. And then biological controls and pesticides. And again, pesticides are listed at the end because they're our last resort. But the keywords here are that this is a long-term thing over the whole season of your garden or over preferably years and decades as you garden into the future. And the other key is that this is a combination of all the things we know how to do. So the main benefit, therefore, is that we minimize the loss of pollinators, we get more productive plants. Um, our money goes to good use rather than wasting money on pesticides or trying to get pollination when you've killed all the pollinators. Um, there's less health risk because what any chemical that damages an insect or even a lot of times plants and diseases can have an effect on our systems as well, because insects share many things in their brain at a base level, chemical signals and things like that, that we have as well. I have a picture of some candy cigarettes down there, not real ones, just so to keep it PG, but nicotine is something that's a natural pesticide, but that we have adapted into a chemical called, one of them is imidacloprid, and those are called neonicotinoids, and that's the main thing we use to fight emerald ash borer, if you're familiar with that. But it comes from something that affects humans, but also affects insects as well, and that's being the nicotine. And there's many other chemicals that are just like that. So this also decreases the risk of pesticide resistance. So when you spray a pesticide too many times, the insect or plant or disease can get resistant to it, just like antibiotic resistance they're seeing in hospitals. And so we want to, just like other fields, reduce the risk of what we're trying to fight being able to fight back. And it protects the environment, which again makes everything more productive. And finally, it's more effective than just using a pesticide alone. So a little bit of background. Most of the plants we get come through a retailer or through some other chain. And even if you raise your own plants from seed, there's still a risk that a disease came, especially on those seeds if they weren't treated properly, or even small insects can make their way into seed packets. So when you're getting plants from an outside source, there's always a risk of bringing something into your garden, and you need to know that risk exists. So the basic principles of IPM to try to stop that risk from getting too big is when you buy something, look at it as close as you can. It may look healthy, and that's the first step. You want to have a plant that looks healthy, but you want to look really closely and make sure there aren't any yellow leaves you might have missed, or brown leaves, or especially small little insects hiding in the cracks and crevices of that plant. And then once you plant your plants, you're going to want to keep watching them throughout the season. This is called scouting commercially, like in corn and soybeans. And I used to do that in the summertime, walking through corn and soybeans for 10 hours a day every day. And uh, I think scouting in the garden is a little more fun than that was. So if you treat it as a learning experience, just walking through and not having any expectation of finding anything, but just seeing what you see. And then something we'll talk about later is crop rotation and plant spacing. So making sure your plants are in the right environment so things aren't more likely to go wrong. And then knowing what you're looking at and making decisions on time, not kind of waiting around to when you know something is wrong. And if you're working with somebody, say in a community garden, or you and somebody else share a garden, good communication is really important to make sure you don't overwater or something, or somebody didn't spray for a pest, and that you go and spray again, making it more damaging to the environment. So Elena has a question. What if the plant you want at the nursery looks great, but the surrounding plants show disease? Should you buy that plant? If you really want that plant, choose that one. Choose the one that's not showing disease. It may have some resistance that the other ones don't have. It may not have been infected yet, but do keep it separate. And I think I might talk about this in a second, but keep it separate from your other plants and watch it more closely. Um, as they begin to grow and develop back at your home. And if you can, if you have an alternative source for that plant, this isn't the only place you could get it. It would be safer to go with another option if you see the warning signs ahead of time. But if you have to make that choice, choosing the healthiest one, but treating it more carefully, is probably the best way to go. And so here, the picture at the bottom, those people work for the USDA, and there are people every day, all day, looking at plants to make sure that nothing invasive comes in, like that emerald ash borer I talked about earlier. It's a serious job, and they do a lot to protect our environment from new things coming in. But you don't need to be as thorough as they are, but just know that this is a real thing that takes place in the industry, and this happens when things are imported to the country. But as things move around states and move around cities and counties, they're not inspected this closely, so you'll need to do some of the inspection yourself. Main thing to look for, don't be afraid to take the plant and turn it upside down in your hand. Be careful. Hold it at the soil level around the base of the plant, and pull the container it's in off the roots. If you can't pull the container off, it's probably root bound, and so you may want to just skip that one entirely. But when you get the container off, you want to look for white roots, not brown or dying roots. And you want to make sure that it has enough healthy roots that it will be able to survive. Look for any spotting, what are called mosaic patterns, which you can think of as just yellow and green window panes, sort of like stained glass. Ringed circles are a really good indicator of bacterial problems. And then just general blotchy spots can mean you've got a fungal or bacterial problem as well. Just general yellowing on lower leaves, especially in a garden center, isn't always a big concern. You want to try to get as few yellow leaves as possible, but plants will naturally lose, especially those first two cotyledons that aren't really true leaves. They're more like food for the plant. They'll lose those naturally. So there will be a little bit of leaf loss at the lower part of the plant that you can expect and not be concerned about. And then if a plant just doesn't look like what you're expecting, you don't have to buy it just because you're in the moment. Take the time and make sure you get the right thing, especially to make sure if it looks strange in a strange way, it might be carrying a virus. And especially for things like asters. If you grow any asters, sunflowers, things like that, there's a disease called aster yellows that can make them uh, make their flower petals green and grow lots of petals. And that virus, once it's in your environment, is hard to remove. So take a note of that plants look the way you expect them to look before you buy them. Another thing you can do is prevention. That what we talked about there is already prevention, but this is prevention in selecting your plants before you even go to buy them, knowing what you're going to buy ahead of time. Particularly with tomatoes and diseases, there are a lot of resistances built in to the things you can buy in a catalog. Usually, you will see them as letters next to the word resist there. If you see under right there where it says #1 super sweet 100 hybrid, right under that it says resist FI/V. I don't have the whole scale up here, but in the catalog it'll tell you what those letters mean. And those are each different diseases that this tomato is known not to get infected by as easily. So if you've had problems with certain diseases in your garden in the past, there are varieties that won't get those diseases quite as easily. And also, if you're trying to just avoid disease in the first place and you don't care too much about getting the perfect heirloom to start out with and you want something that's just going to work, trying to pick something with as many resistances as possible will give you healthier tomatoes. Also, keep a record of what you like and what has done the best in your garden. It's much easier when you have a written record, even if it's something that only you understand. So you're not guessing next year and trying to remember exactly what you liked. And then there's publications and catalogs that tell you what works best in Kansas. And I will link to some of those at the end. I have 3 guides for you all that I think are really, really helpful. And then another aspect of prevention is just cleaning things up. Um, it's really the #1 thing you can do once you already have a garden established that doesn't take any sort of special knowledge or effort. It's just cleaning up what's dead in the garden and making sure it doesn't provide a home for insects or diseases to overwinter or to survive season after season. So remove things as quickly as you can. There's really not much benefit within the garden to leaving the dead things there at the time. You can reintroduce them at the end of the season. You can collect all that stuff, compost it. You don't even necessarily have to compost it, but that helps. But you can then till it back into the soil to get those nutrients back. But during the season, it can cause some problems if you leave that dead stuff there. And here, this is just something I found somebody said that resonated with me that hospitals don't leave parts of people all around the hospital, and you should sort of treat the garden or your greenhouse the same way um, and keep things clean. Prevent any standing water. If you can dig a small ditch to allow a part of your garden to drain, or if you can hill it up and make it a little more elevated, that'll help a lot with disease. And then if you're using pruning shears, maybe you have an apple tree, make sure to cut those shears in between, or to clean those shears in between cuts. Soap can work, but isopropyl alcohol is best. And the reason for this is there's something called fire blight in apples and pears, and it is that top picture you see there. It makes things look as if they've been burnt, which is why it's called fire blight. And a lot of times you'll end up with what they call a shepherd's crook. So the end of the branch will be hooked over and it will look like it had been burnt for some reason. And that spreads as a bacteria that can spread on your pruners. So you want to clean them between cuts. So we talked about scouting. There's a lot of different ways to do that. Walking through your garden is the easiest, most straightforward way. But something you can do, a lot of garden centers will have those yellow sticky cards you might have seen. Those aren't really good for catching all the insects in your garden, but what they do is they show you what's there. They kind of stop a moment in time where an insect gets stuck to it, and you can take a look and see what you're dealing with in your garden, what may be there when you're not there. You can also use indicator plants, which is plants that are more susceptible to disease or insect problems. They're a little weaker maybe at resisting these things, and they'll show you problems earlier than the plants that you're trying to protect. Blue Hubbard squash, which you see at the bottom here, it's a kind of squash that's used for baking and cooking, and a lot of people really like it for that. But what researchers found was that it grows a little faster than the other squash, and if you get it out there ahead of time, insects really, really like blue Hubbard squash over many other squash. And so, if you plant it earlier in your garden at the end of the rows, like you see here, you can attract a lot of the problems to that end plant and spray only that plant, kill all the insects there, and then you're not spraying the squash that you're going to eat later on. So if you have concerns about pesticide residues, this can help. The main thing is to not let those plants you did early get out of control, because then you can be breeding insects at the end of your rows instead of controlling them. So if you're going to do something like that, you need to really commit to it to make sure that uh, it is effective and not causing you more problems. Do disinfectant wipes like Clorox or Lysol disinfect tools as well? They will. Sometimes some of those cleaning chemicals, though, can be a little harder on metal tools and cause them to rust a little bit faster. So if you do use a disinfectant, you're only going to kill bacterial diseases likely. It may not be as effective on viruses. And so it's really just a personal preference, but the most effective is going to be alcohol because it kills more things. But you do want to make sure your tools are dried off. And yes, Tammy asked, is it between every cut or between crops? With apples and pears, it's between every cut if you can, because you never know when you picked up that bacteria and you're getting the next limb sick when you cut it. That's not typical for everything. Pears and apples are much more sensitive to this, but the more that you can clean your tools, and like you said, between crops, that's going to be more important for other things outside of apples and pears. So again, record keeping, not everybody's favorite thing, but keep track of whatever you can. Keep track of what you saw and how much and kind of where it was. There were a bunch of squash bugs on, these pumpkins, and so maybe either next year you're going to need to go out there and look for squash bug eggs ahead of time or try a different type of pumpkin next year. These records just make things easier on you so you're not moving more slowly in your gardening journey than you should be. But at the end of the day, most plant health problems aren't caused by living things. They're not caused by insects or diseases or weeds competing with your plants. But they're caused by things that aren't alive, like how much water the plant has, where the plant was put, and kind of what care went into it. Watering tends to be the biggest issue. You want to avoid overwatering, but just as much as you want to avoid underwatering, which is the one we usually get more scared about. Um, Large amounts of water less frequently is better than daily small shallow waterings. If you go out there and water your garden every day, especially if it's not in the high heat of summer when sometimes you do need to be out there every day. But if you're out there every day, just kind of giving it a little bit of water, those roots are going to be very shallow. It's not going to root itself very deep in the soil. And so when real stress comes, when real drought comes, it's not going to be able to suck up enough water to survive. And so you should allow the soil to dry a little bit between waterings, but then water deeply. Um, we typically recommend an inch, a half inch to an inch a week, up to 2 inches. And if we get that from the environment, a lot of times our gardens will be fine. But it's kind of a balance that, again, taking records of what the plant's water needs and how 100-degree week affected your tomatoes next year will kind of help you not be guessing as much at how much you're watering. But the main thing is um, do water deeply when you do, but don't water deeply often and don't water shallow often. Water should be given to plants early in the day if possible. The later in the day you water, the higher the risk of disease is if you're getting any water on those leaves. if you water at the end of the day, it's the worst time, especially if you're getting water all over your tomato leaves or something like that, because that water will sit and not necessarily evaporate overnight, and the leaf surface will stay wet for 12 or more hours. Most diseases need some sort of water vector to move through in order to get into the leaf surface. And so if that water is there, they can infect your plant. But if that water is not there, your plant's not going to be infected. So keeping that water off the leaf is pretty important. If you water in the morning, it allows the water to dry as the sun comes out, and we tend to have windy afternoons, so that will increase the drying. But the other side of that is we have windy afternoons, so if you go out and water in the afternoon, thinking, "Oh, this isn't late at night, I'm kind of catching the middle point at least," you got a lot more evaporation, so you're wasting water, and the wind is blowing stronger, so that water is blowing off into the distance and not going exactly where you want it. So really what we've found is if you can water early in the morning, that's best. Fertilization is also a problem. If you have too much fertilizer, and this is kind of a extreme example in the bottom right corner of maybe a part of grass that somebody spilled some, if you imagine somebody spilled some fertilizer on, uh, those leaves are lush and green and look nice for a time, but they're packed full of nutrients that insects and diseases would love to get access to, but they don't quite have the defenses that a normal leaf that wasn't over fertilized did. So what you end up with is a really lush plant that ends up getting infected because it grew further than it should have. So you want to make sure to not dump, especially the main culprit is nitrogen. So you want to make sure you're not putting too much nitrogen out there because that can lead to too much leaf growth and extra disease. And at the end of the day, less fruit. The biggest problem we see with fertilization in tomatoes is people putting too much nitrogen, then you end up with too many leaves and not enough tomatoes. Temperature, if things are too cool and you plant too early, this year's been an interesting one because we haven't had too much frost since really late February, early March. And so some people have gone out there and planted early, and those plants may survive, but they can be set back a little bit by cold temperatures. That bottom left picture is some corn that it probably got down to maybe mid 30s, and it has that purple color on it now because the plant had to protect itself from those low temperatures. And that is sort of the visual indicator that corn gives when it got too cold, and that's a stress response. And a lot of plants that are not cool season plants are going to have a stress response. If you've put tomatoes out already, they may not like how cool it gets sometimes. So you want to make sure that you're planting your plants at the right time, and seed packets and garden guides can really help you on that path. And then airflow, not something we always think about. We want to grow big, lush green plants with as many leaves on them as possible. But what we found is that with something like, again, tomatoes, for example, as they grow, and you get tomatoes producing lower on the plant that then rise higher, you can pull those lower leaves off that are no longer producing tomatoes. And that will allow the plant to not only move its resources further up to the fruit, but also let some breeze through there, some wind. And so, with what I said about moisture being on the leaf being a bad thing, the more air you have moving through there, the faster the plant will dry out, even from dew. And so, uh, that airflow becomes essential in preventing disease by not being too dense in the number of leaves that you have. Tomatoes are the number one for that because it's easy to go and pull the lower leaves after the plant has produced fruit. But with anything, if you find that you've got a bush of beans or something and you can't see through it, it may benefit the plant in the long run to go and cut a few runners or vines out to allow some air through and not suffocate your plant. So again, discard diseased plants once they're found, along with dead things in your garden. If you can have your compost pile away from your garden, it will help with some distance in case there's any spores or anything that come from those dead leaves. But really, just getting it out and keeping all that dead and diseased material out of your garden is best. You can compost diseased plants if you do it correctly, but you really need to make sure that you are composting correctly. And what that means is getting the temperatures high enough to kill the diseases and insects that live in there. If you're not familiar with composting, I wouldn't start out by putting diseased or rotten things in there, um, because you may not get up to the right temperatures in your first few tries, and you may end up causing problems for yourself down the road. But generally, lawn clippings, things like that, even if they've been treated to some extent, that will break down over time in compost. Uh, So outside of pesticides, there's a few things we can do to keep insects and diseases out of our garden. Mechanical controls are anything that puts a physical barrier between the problem and your plant. The most common one we see are row covers. So if you're trying to grow maybe some broccoli, some small broccoli, or some lettuce and you have problems with caterpillars or things constantly eating, especially I know if you try to grow broccoli or cabbage, you're going to end up with a lot of caterpillars on your plants. And so putting a little row cover, what is called a floating row cover or a small hoop over your plants can actually just keep those out physically, not being able to get through that net. These can be just as effective as anything else, but they need a little bit more care and maintenance. But it's worth exploring if you're interested. You should also rotate your crops, and I'll show that on the next slide. But what that means is things come in general families, and you may be familiar with them, you may not. But as you garden over time, you'll see that things like tomatoes and potatoes exist in the nightshade family. Things like cabbage and broccoli exist in the brassica family or cabbage family. Um, then you've got your beans. And so what you want to really do is categorize those in your mind and put those types in a specific part of the garden, but only for a single season. The next year, you will then take the things that are in that group and move them to a different part of the garden in sort of a circular rotation, if you will. That bottom one is probably the best. Elena says, do we need to rotate flowers as well? It can be helpful with flowers, especially with things like that aster yellows that I talked about. The issue is that a lot of times the diseases we see spread through flowers like that are spread by insects that can fly a little bit further. And so it doesn't mitigate it as much. But there are certainly root rot diseases and things like that that could affect your flowers. And so if you're doing annuals, it's not a bad idea. And it makes your landscape look a little bit different from year to year, too. So you're not just planting pansies or something in the same spot every year. So there's a couple good benefits to it. And yeah, if you have a small garden, and you can really only put stuff, where it goes, I totally understand that. The best advice I could offer is maybe incorporate one or two containers, somewhere in the space you didn't think you could possibly put a plant. And then rotate problem crops first. So put things, if say you have problems with tomatoes every year, they can have problems being planted in the same spot all the time. You could put them in some 5 gallon containers for a year or two and grow your tomatoes that way and use your garden for something else. So there are some ways around it, but yeah, space doesn't always allow us to do full crop rotation. The other thing I'll say, that picture on the right you may be familiar with is a Japanese beetle trap. We generally recommend people not to buy those unless you own several acres of property and you can put it out at the very corner of your property. What we found is that Japanese beetle traps usually tell all the Japanese beetles in the area, hey, something smells good over here, and then they end up on your property and you don't catch all of them, you end up with a bigger problem than you started with. Um, so fortunately for us, there are things out there in nature already working to stop these pests from affecting your plants. We call these biological controls. I'll show some examples here in a second, but really they're sort of natural predators that are out there already trying to do the work for you, protecting your plants. The main thing to know is you really cannot use or rely on biological controls if you know you're gonna be using pesticides, because those pesticides will kill both the pest and the predator that is trying to help you out. And insecticide residues can affect predators for 3 months or more after application. So just because you sprayed early in the season because you saw a bunch of things and got scared, that still may keep the good insects out of your garden for longer than you would think. So, of all the known insects, only 1/10 of 1% are serious pests. So that means 99.9% of insects out there are not trying to cause us any harm. They have a pretty bad reputation, but the reality is most of them serve a purpose out there in the environment in some way or the other. And a lot of times we don't understand that purpose, especially with things like paper wasps, I think are a really good example. Um, they get a bad reputation because of their cousins, like hornets and yellow jackets, who sting pretty readily and easily, and can cause some real pain for people when they do sting. But paper wasps are a little more social, and generally, if you're not near their nest or in a spot that they perceive as trying to destroy their nest, they're not going to do anything to sting you. And they also will generally warn you ahead of time before they sting you and give you a chance to get out of there. And the reason I say this is because paper wasps can eat entire caterpillars. They rely on nectar from flowers to live, but they also rely on eating other insects in order to live and grow their colony as well. So, if you really struggle with caterpillars in your environment, and there's wasps, in the corner of your house that have been bothering you for a while, and you don't know whether or not to get rid of them, they may actually end up being your friend. But it's just that's a place where it's really hard to win people over because wasps are wasps, and some people are just never going to tolerate having them around. The one we're almost familiar with, though, as far as the good bugs go, would be ladybugs, or the convergent lady beetle, as it's technically called. What might be interesting to you is that these are all different stages of ladybugs. And particularly if you take note of that middle one, that's the nymph stage of the ladybug, and it looks very, very different. It looks nothing like a ladybug, especially if you can see it up close. But all of these stages, except for the eggs, eat aphids. So every part of the ladybug is helping out your garden in some way. And aphids are tricky because they're so tiny. They stick to the leaves pretty tightly, and they reproduce very, very fast. So if you have a good ladybug population out there, they are probably doing a lot of work for you that you don't recognize already. And a couple other good ones. The one on the left is probably my favorite. That's the green lacewing. When they're that adult that you see there, they don't do much as far as pest control. They fly around. I think they're kind of interesting looking because they're clear and green like that, but they don't cause any problems for us. They're just in that last stage of their life. What you see there, and what people will sometimes see, um, like on a vanity in a bathroom or just in the most bizarre places, are these little eggs or what look like grains of rice on a really long hair, and those are green lacewing eggs. Um, so if you see eggs like that on a filament, those are actually our friends that are will be born soon. And then the larva is known as the aphid lion, which is a pretty neat name, and that's where the green lacewing does most of its work. They eat aphids as well as a number of other pests, and then they will pupate and grow into that adult again and start the cycle all over. The other thing is a hoverfly. It looks like a bee. If you showed me that picture and I wasn't paying close attention, I'd tell you that was a bee for sure. But there are types of flies that also do pollination for us and control insect pests. So that large hoverfly larva you see there at the bottom is out there eating a bunch of scale, and scale is another insect pest that is really hard to control on our own because it's so protective. But if we have these beneficials out there doing the work for us, it saves a lot of hard work that we might not even be able to do ourselves. So here's a lacewing larva eating a corn earworm larva. So you can kind of get the idea of the size a little bit maybe on that leaf, but they'll crawl around and it's not just aphids. Corn earworms affect cucumbers as well as corn. So they're out there protecting a couple of your crops. This is another pretty cool one. These are called assassin bugs. They are similar to stink bugs. They're in the same family, but instead of putting holes in your tomatoes and making it hard to can them, these are out there putting holes in other insects, and again protecting your garden. So the same tube or proboscis-like thing you can think of on a stink bug that they use to pierce through tomatoes and apples. These have that same structure, just a little stronger, that they use to pierce through other insects. Here you can see some of the defining characteristics of those predator bugs. Number one are these legs that you can tell are designed for hunting. And then the other one is that pronounced beak, what we kind of think of as a beak, which would be a really strong tube mouth that it uses to eat other insects. This one on the right side is called a wheel bug. It's sort of a variant of an assassin bug, and you can identify it because it's got that spiked ridge on its back that's sort of called the wheel. Uh, if you see these, your garden's in good hands, but I would caution you against trying to move them because that same beak that can poke through an insect can poke into your hand and it won't kill you, but it's going to not feel very good. So do take note that these predators might bite you accidentally if you try to disturb them. So now on to pesticides. Again, these are our last resort and should really only be used when everything else fails. And pesticides aren't just for spraying bugs. Herbicides, fungicides, and various other things are used to control pests that we consider pesticides. And a pest, in this definition, is anything that can cause damage to what we're trying to protect. And this could be insects as well as weeds and even things such as rodents or deer. There's two major groups when it comes to pesticides. The first, which you probably won't come in contact with, but you should know about, are restricted use. In these, you'll need a license and need to undergo training in order to use. The other is unclassified or general use. This is basically what you go to a big box store and pick up on the counter, behind the counter to go and spray your garden. But even if something is, easy to get at Lowe's or hard to get, behind a bunch of ropes at grass pad, they should all be considered dangerous. All pesticides have to be applied according to the label and the directions. And you should know that that label is considered a legal document. And so if you spray something that's not on the label or you use that chemical in a way that's not in the instructions, it can technically be a violation of the law. So it's important to really pay attention to what you're putting in your garden. I talked a little bit about the blue Hubbard squash earlier, and this is an example of using pesticides in as smart a way as we can in order to protect what we're trying to eat and save, leaving a few plants to the side to treat. So this would be that blue Hubbard squash planted. Looks like it had about a 2-week head start as a transplant, and then the cash crop, they call it, the squash they were trying to grow for themselves, was directly seeded into the ground at the same time, just therefore a couple weeks behind in growth. And so where it says at the bottom, remember you need to kill the pests on the blue Hubbard plants. So those are going to attract all your insects, but if you're going to spray, you need to go and spray those plants to kill the insects while they're out there. And if you don't want to spray, those will be the plants you want to go out there and pick the insects off, throw them in a bucket of soapy water, and dispose of them that way so that they don't get back out and reinfect your plants. Choosing the right pesticide, you need a little bit of planning. And you should know that there are some pesticides and you should do some research. If you have a specific problem, there may be a pesticide just for it. My favorite one is BT because it comes in two different types. There's what regular BT, which is Bacillus thuringiensis. It's a bacteria that somehow crystallizes the stomachs of caterpillars. So once they eat it, they can't eat anymore. And it only affects caterpillars or moth caterpillars. And so if you have a problem, just a small problem, maybe with growing broccoli or cabbage or something like that, and it's getting eaten up by all these caterpillars, BT is a good first line of defense because it doesn't affect anything else, no pollinators or anything. It only affects those caterpillars. And that's pretty rare for insecticides. So if you can find something like that, that's much more okay to use than going out with a can of Raid and spraying all your plants. Because first of all, that's not on the label most likely, and second of all, it's just going to kill everything needlessly. The second BT is called BTI, which stands for Bacillus thuringiensis israeliensis. And it is another bacteria, but this one affects only mosquitoes. So if you have a spot in your yard where water collects, maybe an old collection of rocks or something that you can't move and it's just always going to be there, sprinkling a little bit of this in there stops the mosquitoes from completing their entire life cycle, and it's not going to kill anything else. So this is another really good one that I like to see people use, especially before they go hire a service to go fog their yard with a broad spectrum insecticide. These also work for fungus gnats. So if you have house plants that you're bringing in for the wintertime, you may sprinkle some BTI in there and that'll stop the gnats. It's a common thing we see in the fall when people are bringing their plants in. They'll say, I have all these fruit flies coming out of my drain and I don't know where they're coming from. A lot of times those are fungus gnats, which are coming out of your house plants that you just brought inside. And so they look just like fruit flies. And so if you mix this in with the soil, this can stop them from coming out. So the main considerations, and we've gone over most of this already, but am I using the right pesticide for what I'm trying to treat? Am I even legally allowed to use this for what I'm doing, or should I hire somebody? Have I tried everything else and did none of it work? Is this the least toxic thing I could do? Have I read the label thoroughly and do I understand the instructions? And then again, with records, this isn't a requirement, but can you keep a record in case something happens? Maybe a dog gets sick or and you can't explain why. Having a record of what you sprayed in your garden can be really helpful in case any problems arise. And I won't go through this whole thing, but there was a case in Colorado where somebody had sprayed a pesticide on their property and it had drifted onto a neighbor's property. And I believe they had some medical issues and it caused problems for them. And when I went back to it, they had not applied that herbicide the way the label said that they should have, and they were found liable for thousands of dollars of damage for spraying that product incorrectly. So make sure you're using the right thing at the right place. What would I recommend for poison ivy? For poison ivy, it's really tough to spray the leaves, especially further and further as the season goes on. You may notice they get really thick, kind of waxy, and a lot of them will get bumps and strange colors on them. And a lot of that goes towards protecting the leaf from taking any herbicide in. So what we recommend is cutting the vine as close to the base as you can. If you have gloves, you can try to remove as much as you want. Otherwise, you can let the light, the UV light, and other natural processes break down that vine while it's still in the tree or on the ground. But once you cut it, the main thing is to take a herbicide and actually put it right there on the stem where you cut. There's a few of these. Triclopyr is a good one. And then a lot of times people will recommend just general glyphosate or what people think of as Roundup. Uh, Generally, both those will work, but look at your label and see what the rate is. And something we've found that's really helpful is you can go take a craft brush, like a foam brush you'd get from a craft store, and soak that in the herbicide, and then just gently paint that on the stem where you cut. That stops you from spraying anything else in your landscape. You're not going to drift the herbicide onto your roses or kill the grass around a tree. Um, and it's going to get absorbed into the plant, into the roots, and kill it faster. So that's kind of an IPM strategy that benefits you in two ways there. You're applying the right herbicide directly to where you need it to, and it's being effective because there's not much else you could do when you have a lot of poison ivy. That same thing works for honeysuckle, and that's something that we have a lot of problems with around here. If you've got any sort of half wild woods around you, you've likely seen honeysuckle growing in there because it greens up before the rest of our native plants. And so getting it to stop growing is really hard because it has a head start on everything else. So if you can cut those stems and paint them again with a herbicide, it sets them back much further than just cutting them alone or letting them grow, especially. Always wear protection. The more sensitive your skin is in any general area, the more likely it is to take in a pesticide. So that would be things like the soles of your feet, your hands, your waist. Anywhere that the skin is thinner or more sensitive is going to take in the pesticide really quickly. So if you get it all over your hands, you spill it on your lap is a really, really bad one. If you spill pesticide on your lap, you want to call the doctor, call poison control, get out of your clothes, take a shower as quickly as you can. And even if you apply pesticide correctly, um, you should wash your clothes after you apply it to minimize any risk of spreading it anywhere you don't want to. And you should run your washer of an empty cycle to clear it out if you can. Um, Pesticides have to be stored in their original container. Again, this is the law. So you need to store that pesticide in what it came in. And you can't give your neighbor a little bit in a jar or something like that because it can't be resold or which they would consider that when you're not a licensed dealer. And then if a pesticide gets ingested, don't have somebody throw up or anything like that. Call poison control and have them drink as much water as possible to dilute it. And then listen to poison control and what they tell you to do. If you have extra pesticide that you haven't used in years and you know you're not going to use, generally cities or counties will have special programs, and you could talk to the UG or a Bonner or whoever you deal with, and generally several times throughout the year they'll have hazardous waste collection sites, and that's the best time to get rid of your pesticides. And we'll end on just a few common pests that you might see and maybe what you could do about a couple of them, and then any questions that you might have. So if you grow tomatoes, tomato hornworms are the number one to watch out for. They can be as big or bigger than your whole finger. And when you go out there and see that your plant seems to have a lot less leaves on it than it did yesterday, more than likely these were somehow hiding in there. And you'd be amazed. You can look at a plant that looks totally normal, get down close in there. It's covered in huge caterpillars that are blending in perfectly. The number one thing to notice about them is that little horn on their tail there. That's quite why they're called the hornworm. Not particular risk of stabbing you or anything, but just note that it's there and it's a little intimidating. They leave behind really dark, what we call frass, which is insect droppings. So if there's really large pellets, dark pellets around, your plant and you don't see these, but you see a lot of missing leaves that look like something ate them, more than likely it's tomato hornworm. Uh, so these are best controlled by going out there and physically picking them off and putting them in some soapy water, like we talked about earlier. Or if you want to try a first line insecticide, this is a caterpillar, so that BT I talked about earlier would be the safest bet. And again, the main thing about these is they can strip the leaves off your tomato much faster than you would think. Aphids. They're tiny, soft insects. And my boss, when I was a crop scout in Illinois, called them. They have what he called tailpipes on the back. So there are two little tubes on the rear side of them, and aphids suck up so much sugar out of the plant that they suck up more than they can deal with, and the extra sugar comes out of their tailpipes and ends up on the plant. Um, this is called honeydew, and ants love this honeydew. So there's evolved sort of this relationship between aphids and ants, where ants will actually farm aphids in order to suck the sugar out of your plants, and then the ants eat that extra sugar. Uh, these are pretty tricky to deal with because they're so small, and a lot of times they're green, so they blend in really well. But you want to look on the underside of newer leaves on your plants. That's where you'll find them. So if you see small dots or a sticky substance, you likely have aphids or another small soft-bodied insect like that. Uh, Aphids can be really tricky to control, but if you only have them on a few plants, and those plants are strong enough to take a little bit of forceful water spray, that's the best thing we've found, because generally aphids can't fly to move. They can in certain migratory situations, but generally they don't fly, and they're very tiny. So if you spray them off your plant with some water, it's a real tough task for them to climb all the way back up and start feeding again. So, especially if you have indoor trees or something like that, a lot of times greenhouse plants will get aphids. You can just go spray it off in on a sunny day and let your plant dry, and that'll help a lot. The other thing you can do is use things like neem oil, which is a little bit of a safer alternative, but read the label and see if it makes sense for you. Cucumber beetles are one I like to talk about because when I first learned about them, I only really thought about them as a problem in corn. But they're called cucumber beetles, and that's the thing most people have issues with. They can spread what's called bacterial wilt. So it's a situation where an insect and a disease are coming together. And once you get bacterial wilt in your cucumbers, it will pretty much kill the whole plant. But they also feed on corn silks, so what helps the sweet corn pollinate, and they feed on corn roots. So they're called corn rootworm beetles as well. If you're growing sweet corn, there are certain types of sweet corn that are resistant to cucumber beetles, so that may be something that you look at. And the other thing would be if you are in a situation with where you're rotating and you're going from corn to cucumbers, know that may not be the best rotation step because they share a host, and so they're not quite as separate as you might think they are. Stink bugs, we talked about assassin bugs earlier, which are these stink bugs' cousin, but stink bugs are the ones we don't really like. They I don't smell it for some reason, so it's hard for me to talk about, but it's supposed to, I think, smell like cloves or something like that. It's a really strong smell that they exude. But they work by sucking plant juices out, and if you've ever had them in tomatoes or apples, you'll see it as sort of a sunken spot that you can eat around, and it doesn't make the fruit inedible, but it does lower the visual appeal and lower the amount of fruit you can actually eat. Um, Particularly with stink bugs, there's one that has moved in as an invasive species here recently, and they think it's moved along the highway system actually. And that's the brown marmorated stink bug. And this spring, you may have seen these in your house. That's where we see them most often. Uh, these are an invasive stink bug, just like the green ones, but a lot of invasive insects treat our houses like cliff sides or rock formations in their homelands. So, especially if you have a white house, they've found you'll end up with a lot of insects overwintering in your house thinking it's a cliff face or something like that. And so then they'll wake up in the spring and you'll find them crawling around. And then cutworms, if you've got corn or tomatoes, these are small caterpillars that climb along the surface of the ground and then just cut right there and only eat that small little section, kind of wasting the whole rest of the plant. So these are really frustrating ones. But they're easy ones to stop if you just put something like a tin can around the plant while it's growing and really small. You can use a little Dixie cup with the bottom cut out, cardboard, aluminum foil, really anything that will stop the caterpillar from eating that plant right at the ground surface. And then spider mites, I bring them up because they're one that's interesting. A lot of insects don't like hot, dry weather because they dry out really easy. But spider mites, like aphids, are really tiny. And so when they get washed off the leaf, it's hard for them to climb back up. So when we've had hot, dry conditions for a long time, spider mites can be a problem that grow just because they never got rained away. And so if you see small spiderweb looking stuff with little dots and what we call stippling or spots on the leaves, it's a good indicator of spider mites. And another situation where just spraying your plant with some strong water may go a long way towards helping it out. And the last one, squash bugs, and probably the most frustrating one. If you can get their eggs ahead of time and sweep them off the plant and destroy them in some way, that'll save you a lot of stress going forward. But the other thing that we've found are sometimes leaving little strips of cardboard near the garden bed at nighttime and coming and collecting them in the morning. Some of them will sleep underneath that cardboard and attach themselves to it. And so you can get a few out of your garden that way. The other way is to hand pick and put in soapy water again, or if you need to use a chemical, malathion and permethrin are labeled for squash bugs. So here are the guides I talked about, and let me go pull them up and I'll put the links in the chat. The Kansas Garden Guide is going to be your big one. Let me see how many pages. 200 pages. So if you really need some weekend reading material and you want to learn everything there is about gardening, I'd recommend this one that I just put in the chat, the Kansas Garden Guide. If you're just trying to pick some plants that will do well in Kansas, this next one is recommended vegetable varieties. And it is a just a straight list of specific varieties of broccoli. So I'll just pull one right here. Diplomat broccoli we recommend. So not a name I've ever heard of, but now if I see it in a garden catalog, I'll know, oh, that's one that could grow well here in Kansas. So it just simplifies things a little bit. And then finally, our vegetable garden planting guide, which I'm putting in the chat now. And it is sort of meets you halfway between those first two guides. This will tell you what kind of plants grow well, and then also how many plants you need to feed a person if you want somebody to eat that plant all year long, um, how much you can expect to yield per 10 feet of row of this plant, how close to put them together, when to plant them, really everything. So I'd really recommend starting out with that vegetable garden planting guide if you're just getting going. So let's see. Alrighty, so now this is just a thank you to the people that helped put the presentation together, and my email is right there at the bottom. Feel free if you have questions about your own diseases and pests as the season goes on. I'm happy to try to answer those for you. All right, and thank you all for your time, and thank you, Elena, for having me again today.
Thank you very much, Corey, for this wonderful presentation. I'm sure it's very helpful to everybody. And everybody, please ask your questions. You have such a great opportunity. Here's a question.
We always have a ton of webs, and it's hard to determine spiders or spider mites. Okay, so the best thing I can recommend there is that if the webbing is really fine and almost like a I don't know how to describe it, like a cottony almost webbing rather than a spider webbing. That's generally a spider mite indicator. The other thing you'll see is again, it's a little tougher to tell, but if you focus on that left picture, if you imagine somebody went through with a needle and just poked that leaf a whole bunch of times, it would yellow and a bunch of little needle pricks, and that's what the spider mites leave behind. Is sort of what we call stippling. So if you see lots of little spots, that's a really good indicator.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This spring, I see a lot of my flowers, the heads of them being cut off, either on the trees or on the ground, like tulips or daffodils or flowers on magnolia trees,
But fully formed
fully
flowers,
formed, and
yeah.
they just cut off. What could be causing this?
The thing that would cause that most likely would be the temperature just getting into a range the plant wasn't comfortable with, I guess is the best way to describe it. And so when plants feel stressed like that, they'll abandon the flower and let it drop because it would rather reserve its resources to try again next year, to be healthier, to try a flower next year. Because especially with trees, they've got a little longer term strategy. Something that's not quite related, but kind of related, is if you've got acorns or sweet gum trees, you may notice some years you get a lot of acorns or like your yard's full of sweet gum balls, and it's a real pain to try to get rid of them all. And then the next year it seems like there's none, and that's because they will get into sort of what's called biennial bearing. So they'll have a really heavy year, and then it used all its resources that year. So it saves them the next year, doesn't put very many acorns out, and then you get a whole bunch. So it's a sort of similar situation where it's about preserving the tree's resources in the environment.
Could it be that, for example, tulip trees, tu- tulip flowers are being cut off by animals?
That that entered my mind, but I don't know of any that do that. But with the cutworm existing and it does it to plants, there may be an insect out there that does it to flowers I'm not aware of. But the only thing I can think of is there have been a few days with questionable temperatures that may have been around that same time. And it doesn't always have to freeze. It just has to get low enough that the plant drops the flower because it thinks it's going to die anyways.
Interesting.
Um, how to keep squirrels and chipmunks out of garden pots? They dig holes and eat freshly planted beans and cowpeas. Yes. When I first moved up here, I had a peach tree in Midtown, and I never got a single one for myself. The squirrels had every one. And very frustratingly, they'd usually only eat a couple bites and realize they didn't really like it that much. So wasteful too. Um, the issue with squirrels is that they will more or less find a way around anything that we try to do to keep them out. So if you have specific plants that they're targeting, like tomatoes or things like that, it may be a good idea to do that physical exclusion, like I talked about. Maybe putting a net or a cage around those few plants that they're really robbing you of. And if you can't do that, uh, there are motion activated deterrents. So things that will spray some water or shine a light when they detect something coming up. And those can work for a while, again, until the squirrels adapt. And then there's also um, products you can spray on your plants or around your plants that will keep deer and other mammals away. And it works to some extent on squirrels. Uh, the main thing is that you need to reapply those products immediately after it rains because they become pretty much totally ineffective after a rain. And after a week or two, you'll need to go reapply anyways as well because they just don't last very long. But there are a few options out there. Unfortunately, squirrels are the hardest thing to keep out because they're so small and they can get through so many different things. All right. Well, thank you, Elena. This was fun, and I hope maybe fewer questions this time means that I covered more stuff that people already were wondering about.
Thank you very much, Corey. Thank you, everybody, for coming over here. And at the beginning of the program, I put an announcement in the chat about upcoming program on how to grow your own tomatoes on April 29 at 11 o'clock. This program will be in person at the main library of Kansas City, Kansas Public Library. So everybody is welcome to attend and see how we can grow our own tomatoes.
Oh, and I will also say, in case I didn't already, that we have our Master Gardener plant sale for the Wyandotte County Master Gardeners coming up next Friday and Saturday. And so that's going to be at our office just west of the old Kmart on State Avenue. You can look us up on Google to find the exact directions, but we're K-State Research and Extension in Wyandotte County, and it'll be right there in that strip mall. But yeah, Friday from 9 to 5, Saturday from 9 to 2. Come pick up a few seedlings or plants and get your garden started.
Again, thank you everybody very much, and look for this video to be posted on library's YouTube channel. And I posted my email address into the chat. If you want to email me, I will email you the link to the YouTube video probably on Monday. Thank you again, and everybody have a great day.